Today, we are extremely delighted to welcome Dr. David Neymar from the University of Virginia, where he is an assistant professor of media studies, a faculty affiliate in Latin American studies and the Global South Lab, and assistant director of the Deliberative Media Lab. David also has affiliations with many other institutions. He is currently a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and a visiting scholar at the Institute for Rebooting Social Media. In addition, he is an affiliated scholar with Princeton's Brazil Lab, so a lot of different pathways. David's background reflects the interdisciplinary of our discipline. He holds 2 bachelor's degrees from Brazil, one in computer science and the other in business administration, a master's in computer science from Saarland University in Germany, a master's in anthropology from the University of Virginia, and his doctorate in computing, culture, and society from Indiana University. With his background and training, David's work is primarily ethnographic in nature, and he has conducted field work in the slums of Vitoria, Brazil, Havana, Cuba, Guadalajara, Mexico, and Eastern Kentucky, Appalachia. He has written a number of books, including Favela Digital, The Other Side of Technology, published by Editorial GSA, and a new book out by MIT Press titled Technology of the Oppressed. His presentation today will be on this new monograph. So please join me in welcoming Dr. David Neymar. So thank you so much for coming. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is mine. As you can see, I'm a never-ending lifelong student. I finished my master's in anthropology after I joined UVA as faculty. So, you know, in case you're deciding to become a professor, never tweet or post anything on Facebook that this is the last class you're ever gonna sit on, because it's gonna get back to you. So I learned this lesson. Let me try to share. Am I able to share my, yes, okay. Let me go here. Okay, can you see it? Perfect. Okay, so again, thank you so much for having me. And Ewan, how many minutes do I have?
So we have the colloquium all the way to 5 p.m. Although the timing is flexible. So typically we would have something like a 35 to 45-minute presentation, but there's a lot of flexibility. So go with the pace that suits you. Yeah. All right.
All right. So today I'll give a presentation about the book that was just recently released by MIT Press on February 15th. So you guys are pretty much my first audience in presenting the book after it came out. So I truly appreciate that. And here I'm going to try to do something new. I never actually, and this is the problem I think of writing a book based on a 10-year research project. There's so much into this book that I thought I could like break it into 1 or 2 or 3 books. And when I told this to the editor, he said, do not think about writing a 500-page book, which I wasn't going to, but there's a lot of content there that it deserves a lot of attention into the specifics of each chapter. So I thought here to give a little bit of each, a taste of each chapter, because it truly builds up on the framework that I try to elucidate in the book. So I thought about talking a little bit about the introduction and then the mundane technologies, which is my framework, then go into the second chapter, which is on infrastructure. So basically what it means to live in a broken city. And then look into the spaces where they use technology, which are the CTCs, or the telecenters and the land houses, how they use social media to get by, and then go a little bit into the gender aspect of being a marginalized and oppressed woman, as well as go into the issues of class. And then finally bring a little bit of my latest research on misinformation and WhatsApp. And then try to finish this with a little bit of hope. So this is how I end the book, which I talk a little bit about technologies of hope. So I'm I want to start with the story of Pedro. Pedro, it was one of the first people I met. And I remember going into the LAN house, which is like a computer lab, where it's cyber cafe, kind of like, where people pay to use the internet. And I remember him being all mad. He was by himself, typing his CV, and then he didn't want to be bothered. And then he was complaining how he just got fired and he had no perspective in life. He was just trying to type something to see if he could do something and find a job. And then I was talking to him. I said, well, let's go to the telecenter. I have a meeting over there. And maybe the inclusion agent, who's the person who takes care of the telecenter, can help you find a job. There are all kinds of websites over there, so you can submit your CV. And then we went to the telecenter. I went to my meeting, and he was in the computer lab, playing around with the computer. And he was someone who hated technology. He couldn't stop talking how much he hated technology. So I didn't expect to see him after my meeting. But when I left my meeting, surprisingly, he was there. He was very excited because he found this website where he could upload his CV and try to find matching jobs. So he was very excited. He went to being completely hopeless to with a little bit of hope. And then he was like showing me all around the computer skills that he had just gotten in 5 minutes, and that he just found out about Google. And then he called my attention and said, hey, David, look at this Google thing. You can search for anything. Everything is in here. But I doubt that they know about our favelas. Let's Google Bairro da Penha, which was one of the favelas. And he was like, wow, they have stuff about us. They know about us. It was interesting to see his reaction, because he went from 5 minutes enjoying the happy surprise of his search results. Then after 5 minutes, he was like recalling after clicking on images, then he felt silent. And then he said, well, they only talk about crimes, drug traffickers, and tragedy. Is this what rich people think about us, the world? And then he turned around to me and said, David, you know this technology thing. Can you fix it? And I mean, looking at me, and I was like, oh gosh, he just went from being completely helpless to with a little bit of hope, and now he's back into being helpless. I said, well, I cannot fix this technology. It's embedded in this web of power that is beyond us here. It's developed with a completely different perspective. It's not developed for us. So I don't know what to do. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't fix it. And then he turned around, he printed his CV, grabbed his CV, and then left the telecenter and looked back and said, well, maybe we can. And then he walked away. And I thought that was very interesting, because I think he was right. Pedro was right. Maybe they can. Maybe people from the favelas or the urban slums of Brazil, they can. But Pedro and every oppressed favela resident occupy an institutional system designed to exploit them. And digital technologies may be perceived as paving a pathway to a better life, but this route is hardly open to everyone. So this is kind of the story that I tell in the book. I tell this route and how they negotiate with the different sources of oppression, especially the technology who are developed under the oppressor's rationale, and how they negotiate, appropriate, and try to make that technology work for them so they can find a little bit of hope in their lives and try to find, if not a little bit of liberations. So when talking about oppression, of course, the first person that comes to mind, at least in my mind, is Paulo Freire, right? I'm from Brazil. So is Paulo Freire. He is the patron of Brazil's education, and he's very well studied in Brazil. But what is interesting is that very few people talk about Paulo Freire outside the realm of education, of pedagogy. For those who don't know, Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educationalist and philosopher whose radical ideas about pedagogy, learning, and knowledge established the critical pedagogy movement. So he's the author of the classic Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I heavily base my framework on. So according to Paulo Freire, one of the fundamental elements of oppression is prescription, which are guidelines that impose the consciousness of the prescriber, which is the oppressor, upon the consciousness of the prescribed, which is the oppressed. In other words, the behavior of the oppressed is defined by the oppressor, a form of control that impedes their achieving freedom. In favelas, prescriptions are imposed not only through laws and boundaries, prescriptions are also designed into algorithms and technological affordances of digital technologies. So when I was reading about Paulo Freire's understanding of oppression and how oppression is pretty much a set of commands, a prescription, the first thing that came to mind was algorithm, right? This is how computer programs are designed. And it's not surprising that, technology comes with this mindset of oppressing. Of course, I'm not the first one to say. Sophia Noble wrote a great book, which is, I'm blanking out, it's Algorithms of Oppression. And then Virginia Eubanks wrote another book, amazing book called Automated Inequality. They follow the same rationale that oppression is often embedded in code. And by bringing this understanding of Paulo Freire, we can see that while this prescription, it's what defines behavior, and this behavior comes from the oppressor onto the oppressed. What is interesting about Paulo Freire is that, like I said, oftentimes his studies are, most people go to Paulo Freire to talk about education and pedagogy. But in one of the interviews that he gave to his daughter, he said, I don't want to be imported or exported. It is impossible to export pedagogical practices without reinventing them. Ask educators and researchers to recreate and rewrite my ideas. So this is what I do in this book. And this was actually a good way to justify to those who are hardcore Paulo Freire theorists to say, hey, he told us to rewrite his ideas. And it's time for us to readapt his knowledge to the so-called information era, because there's so much from his teachings that we can bring to the digital technology studies, media studies, so we can better understand how oppression happens in the digital era. So for this book, I asked the following question: and how can favela residents use digital technologies in their quest to liberate themselves and regain their humanities? And for that, I propose a framework called mundane technology. And by that, I focus on how mundane technology goes beyond digital artifacts. So of course, I'm not the first one to coin this term, mundane technology. Paul Dorish has talked about it. He has co-edited a special issue on this. But my understanding of mundane technology goes a little beyond about not just digital technologies, but the appropriation of technologies. So as I said, they refer to the process of the oppressed appropriating everyday technologies. So technological artifacts, operations, and spaces, and using them to alleviate oppression in their everyday lives. So mundane technologies also encompass non-productive activities and desires that people engage with through everyday digital technologies. Mundane technologies is the decolonial framework aimed to understand how people exercise their agency and consciousness and appropriate technologies to mobilize themselves towards a quality of life they desire. So basically, it's how favela residents use and tinker with technology to have the technology working for them. For this book, in this research, I did this work in the slums of Vitória. And Vitória is the state capital of Espírito Santo, which is a state right in the southeast region of Brazil. As you can see here, it's right next to Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Vitória is not very big. It's only 300,000 inhabitants. It's my hometown. It is a very rich city. So it has the fourth highest GDP per capita and the second highest human development in the country. However, these numbers are misleading because Victoria has also the second highest concentration of wealth, which means that the rich is very rich and the poor is very poor. So the first time that I got into back to Victoria to do this field work, I collected the census data and tried to understand how the class system works in the city. And the reason why I did this was because Brazil society is divided based on income. So these social classes are based on income. And I wanted to know where the rich was and the poor was. As you can see here, there seems to be a divide between the east side and the west side. So the east side is very rich and the west side is also, is where the lower classes live. This is not very surprising because social inequalities is big in Brazil. Basically, people are segregated, in the favelas. But what is interesting is that Brazil has this weird thing that we claim that Brazil is not a racist country. Brazil, it just has an issue with social classes. Like Brazilians just hate the poor. They don't really hate Black people. Like, we're not racist. But then I decided to collect the same data on race. And by mapping that data on the same map, you can see that there's also a racial divide in the city, where on the East Coast, that's where white folks live, and on the West side is where the Black people live. And as you can see, if you put this map, it's almost like as if overlaps with the poor being Black and the white being the rich. I mean, it's not surprising. So this is one of the arguments that I bring, that we should look into a more intersectional framework to understand how oppression actually works. Because just looking into issues of class would not give us an overall understanding of how oppression works, the same way that just looking at race would not give us such an understanding. So I try to bring in the book this intersectional approach where I'm constantly looking into race and class, but though I focus on gender on a specific chapter, then I bring more than one, let's say, variable there. But throughout the book, I'm constantly talking about race and class. So the favelas that I did this work, like I said, it was in Vitória. And as you can see, this shaded area here, that's where the favela was. It's right in the middle of the city, right? It's not in the outskirts or the suburbs, it's right there. And yet the Vitória society managed to exclude this territory and the people who live there. I don't know how familiar you are with favelas, but oftentimes favelas are found on hillsides. And I can talk a little bit about this later, but it's basically because of how Brazil was colonized. The Portuguese tried to claim every flat land because it was better for farming. And once slavery was abolished and the enslaved people were set free, they were set free without any sort of reparation. So the only empty land was the hillsides. So it's not surprising that favelas are comprised of Black people, and these are the only lands that they found back then. So this is the hill of where the favelas that I did my field work was. And just to give you an understanding of how the landscape is organized. So at the very bottom, that's where you have the shops and the market. So this is like the shopping mall of the favelas. It's more urban-like. It's actually right at the border between the city and the favela. At the very middle there, that's where you have the houses. So if you ever seen any of the movies like City of God, and you see those shack houses, those very straight alleys, this is where probably was. And at the very top, and this was interesting to see, I don't know if you can see this, it's a bit empty on the very top. And this was because of that's where the drug cartel stayed. The reason why they stayed there was because it was easier to watch when the cops were coming up, so they could prepare. And also, it was easier to see when rival gangs were trying to attack them, the cartel that was established in the favela. And also they deployed all kinds of war tactics, because as you can imagine, it's easier to attack from top to bottom than bottom up. And during my field work, so I started doing this field work in 2012, and then did 10 months in 2013 and came back for follow-ups. But in 2013, that's where I did the bulk of my field work. It was the hardest time to do this field work because Brazil was getting ready to host the Olympics and the World Cup, so 2014, 2016, and the government had a terrible idea of pacifying the favelas from Rio and Sao Paulo, and of course which was actually an act of social cleansing, so it was very criminal. But anyways, the drug lords who managed to run away from these favelas in Rio and Sao Paulo, they came to Victoria due to the proximity, and they wanted to continue their drug business. So they put themselves in war with the already established drug cartels there. So it was an intense time to do field work. Unfortunately, I saw many shootouts, not very safe, but I survived. Most of my informants survived. I still stay in touch with them. And luckily, I didn't see anything more serious in a shootout. That it's quite scary. But anyways, so for this research, I focused mostly my work on the CTCs, which are community technology centers. And CTCs are umbrella terms that comprises of libraries, telecenters, cyber cafes. And the CTCs that I focus here were LAN houses. So LAN houses are basically like cyber cafes, but not so formal. So this is where people go to play video games. This is actually where they have access to video game consoles like Xbox and PlayStation, just because these video games are very expensive in Brazil. Also, they go for many other activities like printing their bills and paying bills and printing their homework, doing research for school. Basically, this is an extension to their schools as well. So both of the LAN houses that I did work was right in the middle of the hill. And then I also did for 2 telecenters. One was at the very bottom where the access was very easy. And then the other one was at the top, which access was hard in the beginning, but then things got better. And as I got more used, as my informants got more used to me being around, then access there wasn't a problem. This field work started in 2012, and then the bulk of the field work was in 2013, and I kept coming back for follow-up field work until 2019. So I started this book by talking about the infrastructure of the city, because I thought this chapter would give us a good understanding of what it meant to live in the city that is constantly being broken. And not broken by those who live there, but broken by those who live outside of the city, right? So they live in constant infrastructure precarity and infrastructural neglect, and they rely on each other to repair their infrastructure. And their infrastructure is not just cables and poles, but also small infrastructures like the keyboard and also mobile cell phones. One of the interesting things that I realized over there was that the LAN houses and the telecenters, they didn't have large data centers, or they didn't have any storage room for their devices. They actually had storage rooms for power supply units. Here in the US, it's mostly known as the fan. So basically, this is what protects the motherboard and memory and everything inside the computer from frying if there's any power outage or anything going wrong with your electricity. And the reason why they needed this was because the infrastructure was so precarious that energy flows wasn't so constant. So they would have energy spikes all the time, which would fry the fans or the power supply units. One owner of the LAN house once told me that Changing the light bulbs here is a freaking activity, but they are cheap. What really concerns me is how often the power supply units fry. Most of the time, I don't have money to buy a new one right away, so I have to put the computers away until I can buy a new power supply unit. So this was the most wanted piece of equipment over there. And it was interesting to see how they developed their own techniques to recycle power supply units. And those techniques were actually based on indigenous knowledge. It actually came from repair spaces where they would fix radios and cars. So they brought that sort of knowledge into fixing power supply units. As I mentioned, the infrastructure neglect was not just on electricity, but also on providing internet access to the folks there. So basically, internet service providers refuse to go into the slums and provide access to them, or even invest in the infrastructure so they can provide that last mile so people could connect. They thought it was not a profitable field, it was not a profitable area, so they just let people, unserved. And this is very problematic because Brazil has internet regulation laws that defines that every Brazilian has the right to have access to the internet. So, of course, in Brazil, this is a clear case that poor and Black folks are not considered, first-class citizens because the law doesn't apply to them when it comes to them. But they didn't stop there. So, which was the case of Gustavo. He was the owner of a land house, and he saw the lack of connectivity there actually as a business opportunity for him. He had an uncle who lived close to the border of the favela. So he was able to sign up to get a membership at his uncle's house. And then he brought about 500 cables of Ethernet cables up the hill through and connecting in 15 Linksys routers all the way up to his land house. And from his land house, he was able to sell connections to his neighbors for about $5 a month. And in total, he was able to pay for the subscription and also to make a little bit of money. What was interesting was that I remember following the Ethernet cables, and it took me a while to understand what those gray boxes were. They were basically there to protect the Linksys from rain and wind. But of course, hillsides are very windy. So Gustavo was the most loved and hated person in the favela, because loved, he brought internet to everybody, but hated because the precarity of infrastructure wouldn't keep the internet as stable as people hoped for. So people would go often to his house or to his land house and just knock on the door and beg him to reconnect the internet because they had to post something on Facebook. So he would have to go out in the rain, and it's dangerous, but he would still manage to fix to keep his people happy. But it was really interesting to see the technological and the social configurations that allowed this internet to get to the top of the favela. And as I mentioned, as we're talking about infrastructure, we tend to think about big infrastructure, right? Internet, electricity, but also affected them in terms of small infrastructure. And one of the infrastructures that I look into is the keyboard. They really hated the keyboard. It was really interesting because they kept asking me why the keyboard layout was designed this way. For them, it didn't make any sense. I mean, it does not make any sense to us, but we take for granted, right? And that really blew my mind, because even as I'm from Brazil, but I'm from an upper class there, typewriters was always part of our day-to-day life, right? If we go to an office, a typewriter is there. So we're used to the QWERTY keyboard. It was designed so keys wouldn't get jammed, and it would optimize the English typing. But of course, as things go digital, there's no need to have the QWERTY keyboard just because keys will not jam. But due to historical factors, then we decided to keep the design and layout. For them, typewriters were never part of their lives. They were always used to have things organized alphabetically, right? Or in numerical order. And it would truly get in the way for those who wanted to use the keyboard. One interesting informant was Maria, and she was a character, but she would never give up. She would keep trying to use the keyboard. And one day she told me that I'm trying to learn how to use this thing, but it doesn't make sense. I waste so much time to write. Something because I can't find the right letters. It gets in the way of learning this thing, the computer. I feel angry and unmotivated, but that's okay because when I find the damn letter, I don't push it, I punch it. And she would truly punch it. And she was a brave woman. She was willing to learn because she wanted to stay in touch with her daughter who lived on the other side of the favela. And it was really hard for her to walk all the way there. So she had no other option. Other people felt completely discouraged from using this keyboard. And for them, it was especially harder because the keyboards were constantly being used. So they were overused. So the ink on each key would fade away quite rapidly. So having a layout that they don't understand and the ink fading away, it was very hard for them to guess which letter was next to other. So I remember I held a focus group, and it was kind of on a workshop, and we broke apart the keyboard. And I asked them to come up with the layout that they would enjoy the most. All of them came up with a keyboard on alphabetical order. And then I said, why? Why would you do that? And he said, well, the keys here fade away so fast that if, for example, letter C, the ink on letter C fades away, then I know that it's a C because it's right next to a D, which is right next to an E. I'm like, oh, that is very right. So this shows you how situated knowledge happens and how technology is used in such a, based on such local manners. And that was like one of the first findings that really blew my mind. So of course, there are studies out there that say that keyboards and alphabetical layouts don't work, they're not efficient. But when they test efficiency, they're always testing with the Western mindset, meaning that it's not efficient for Americans or for English typers. But they're not testing when people in the favelas are using this keyboard. Efficiency maybe not be the ability to type fast, but the ability to write and the ability to learn this thing called the computer, as Maria said. So I thought that was a very interesting thing. And it was really interesting to watch Maria type it. And each key that she would find, it was almost like a victory for her. So anyways, in the book, I talk how maybe having a keyboard in alphabetical order could be the beginning of this transition where the people could, as they get used to the keyboard, they can switch the keys slowly until they get to the QWERTY keyboard, because as we know, if they're about to hit the job market, for example, they're likely to see a keyboard that follows the QWERTY layout, not the one that they would design. In the next chapter, I focus mostly on the spatiality of CTCs. So at first I talk as mundane technologies as infrastructure or as repair. But here I'm talking about mundane technologies as space, right? In the book, I focus on how these spaces go way beyond the T. And by that, I mean, it's first a community center and later a technological center. Most of the time in the literature, when we're talking about, cyber cafes, telecenters, libraries, we tend to think of these spaces as places where people go, use the computer and leave, which is not quite accurate because these are places where people stay. There's so much sociality that happens in there that it's worth unpacking. And this is what I did. Spending time there, I could see that, it was a space where people held birthday parties. It was where the mailman would come and dump all the letters, the mail that were meant to go to that favela, because people would write Maria's house right next to the barbershop. They would write instructions instead of the address, and this was not their fault because these people did not own the land. They didn't have the land title, so they didn't have an official address. So the mailman would come to these spaces and just leave the mail there, and the community would work together to make sure that they would distribute the mail. It was also a place where they would do community building. That's where they would update each other about the news. News meaning gossip about the region. Also, it was the point of contact that they would have with the government. These people would work from sun up to sundown. They wouldn't have time to deal with their bureaucracies. Brazil is a very bureaucratic state, meaning that everything you need, you have to go to the city hall, get 1,000 stamps, process it through different departments so you can move on with your bureaucracy. So unfortunately, they don't have time for that. So they have to rely on e-government websites. And the only way that they can have access to those websites is through these centers. So these centers actually become a representation of city halls for them. And also, it's an extension of their schools. The schools do not have computer labs, so they would come and take advantage of the internet to do their homework, to do their assignments, do research. So anyways, as you can see, it was a social place, a community place first, then a technological space. And one of the things that I realized was how these spaces were perceived as safe places. And the first time that I realized this was when I was, it was actually my second month doing field work. And then the first shootout happened. All hell broke loose. I saw like bullets shattering glasses. I saw, unfortunately, a person getting shot. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen. I thought that was going to be the end of me, and I didn't know what to do. But of course, I had the insight. The first insight that you learn in your ethnography 101 is that when in doubt, follow your informants. That's what I did. I followed my informants, and I realized that they all rushed inside the land house. And that kind of like got my attention. I didn't know why they would go there, but I did. I rushed in there. I grabbed one of those big old CRT monitors, put in front of my head, hoping that a bullet wouldn't go through it. But then I was shaking, but then the people there were not shaking. They were calm, although all the shootouts were still happening. So I talked to them. I said, "Why aren't you guys worried?" And they said, "Well, listen, the cartel understands the vitality of this place. They understand the importance of this place. Nobody's going to come in here and cause trouble. Nobody's going to aim at the land house. They respect this space the same way that they respect the local market, the local church, the local school." So this is where people actually found shelter when they found themselves in danger. So I thought that was really insightful. So much so that I started looking into how these spaces were seen as safe spaces. So mothers in the favelas often worked as domestic workers in Brazil. They didn't have a place to leave their kids at. They didn't have money to pay for babysitter. So leaving these kids unattended on the streets playing soccer was kind of dangerous because they were at risk of getting recruited by the cartel. And of course, the mothers didn't want that. So they actually locked their kids inside the land houses or the talent centers the whole day because they trusted these areas because they knew that they wouldn't be recruited in those spaces. So they stay there safe and sound. Several times, people get online and check in with their moms and then go back into playing with their other friends and the waiting room or out, away from the computers. But they would stay in those places because it was a way to remain safe in those areas. All right, so the next chapter, I talk a little bit about Facebook and how Facebook became the big thing in Brazil. Before then, Orkut was the #1 social media network. Unfortunately, due to zero rating and free basics plans of Facebook, Facebook became the #1 platform and set the stage for WhatsApp to become the #1 means of communications in the country right now. But what was interesting to see how they used Facebook was that they would not dare to post anything on their walls in the timelines, right? They were very afraid of being judged or even fear retaliations by posting something. They knew that they were being surveilled. They knew that people from the cartels and even from upper classes were watching what they were posting. So they didn't want to be made fun of because of their Portuguese or their slangs, because people from upper classes could judge them as being illiterate or uneducated or poor, or posting information that the cartel would deem not appropriate to be there, and they feared feeling the retaliation. Pedro said once that when I asked him why he wasn't posting anything on Facebook, he said, "Are you crazy posting on Facebook?" They often call Facebook face. "I'm very careful to the things I post on here. I mostly share stuff that other people create, like funny images and cool photos. When I have to talk to someone, it all goes on chat because I know for sure who I'm talking to. And if someone spills the beans, I know who the person was. I'm even afraid to talk with people outside the streets. The light poles, walls, cars, everything here has ears, and you don't want to be heard by the wrong people." So as you can see, the cartel and the fear of expressing themselves shaped their behavior, not just online, but also offline. And this was problematic because of the drug war that was happening there. The boundaries of the territories were shifting quite often, which means that sometimes one area was ruled by one drug lord, but the next day it could be that that area was ruled by another one, just because of the constant war and these boundaries were shifting. So people relied a lot on these centers and on Facebook chat to stay in touch with the family members, because walking in the streets was very dangerous, specifically in that time period because of the new cartels that were joining, and they put themselves into war. Maria said to me once that she said, "My daughter lives with her family in Barrio da Penha, which is another favela. I haven't been able to see her for more than 1 month. I live in Itararé, and I don't have enough credits on my cell phone to call her every day. And attempting to go up the hill to see her is too risky. I never know when all hell will break loose. It makes me sad because I can't see my 2-year-old granddaughter growing up. The telecenter has helped me keep in touch with them. She goes to the land house next to her house, and we get on Facebook and chat, exchange the Lord's words. She sends me photos of my granddaughter, and we even play games sometimes. It's not the same as us being together, but at least I can rest assured that they are safe." So as mentioned by Maria, the CTCs allowed her to break these invisible walls that were so hard to follow as they were shifting the boundaries by the cartel, and help her maintain the relationships. Another case was the expression of the selfie. Before, as mentioned by Pedro, everything seemed to have ears in the favelas, right? And people were repressed and feared to be themselves. And they found on Facebook a way to express their feelings and emotions, as mentioned by Paula. She said, "The Life Games, the land house, is right next to my house, and I can use their Wi-Fi connection. I have the opportunity to use it most of the time. I put my hand in my pocket, and just to know that it is in there, the Facebook, I feel safer. With it, I can get out of this crazy reality anytime I want. I can cry, scream about my pain, because I know that somebody will be there online listening to me. I can, for a moment, be myself." Also, the expression of the self do not only come in the form of text, right? But most of the informants post selfies on their Facebook page as a way to express their feelings without being too explicit with their opinions. They developed this technique of saying a lot without disclosing a lot. So it's saying a lot by disclosing a little. And this actually I realized about this when right after one of the shootouts, Larissa, for example, rushed into the land house and she was crying, and then she posted a selfie of her crying. And at first, knowing that they were constantly being surveilled by the cartel, I thought that was a dangerous move, but she did it anyway. And then I realized that 15 minutes later, someone was outside the land house looking at his phone and looking at her. I could tell that he was not a friend. And he got her attention and asked her to step outside, and she did. It was like a very chilly moment, and I thought she was going to get in trouble. And then they talked. She came back. She was like rolling her eyes and saying, "Did you see that, David?" I was like, well, yes, but what happened? He wanted to know if my selfie here crying was about the shootout that just happened. And he said that if I'm not happy here, that I should leave. And I said, oh, wow, that's intense. And I said, what did you say? He said, well, what I usually say. I said that I had a fight with my boyfriend. That's why I was posting this selfie crying. Although that message worked for the cartel people, for her audience specifically, they knew exactly what she meant. They knew that she was not happy with the living situations of the favelas. However, those who are outside her social world did not understand it and understood it as a fight with the boyfriend. So this was a way for them to realize their emotions and maintain their safety. Also, it was a way to overcome illiteracy. As you can imagine, illiteracy was a big problem in the slums. The public schools in Brazil are terribly served. I had many informants that were matriculated in school, but they couldn't read and write. But one thing that Marcos did, which was really interesting, was that he would check in with his mom because his mom was working outside the favela. She would drop in there, and she would tell him to post a selfie every other hour, so she would know that he was safe. I think I have a quote from him here. It said, my mom works the entire day and I have nothing to do after work. I love playing soccer on the streets, but it's dangerous due to the drug street managers wanting new people in their team. I always post photos of myself to show my mom where I am and that I'm okay. She always checks her face at work during her breaks, which is quite interesting because his Facebook timeline is all like selfies of him. And every selfie, there's a like. So there's an acknowledgement of the mom that she saw, and then he can go back to playing with his friends away from the computer. And then I move on in the book to talk a little bit more about the gender aspect of oppression in the favelas. So if folks in the favelas were oppressed, the women from the favelas were even more so. They were not only oppressed by the men in the favelas, but also by men who lived in upper neighborhoods that preyed and objectified Black women constantly. What is interesting and sad was that by joining them and following them, I could see what it means to be, not that what it means to me, sorry, but the struggle that they face just to be on Facebook. For us, man, we say, we get on Facebook, we have fun. We look at the notifications, we look at what people said to us, and that's fine. Once I was joining Fernanda, and she called me and said, look what it means to get on a woman's Facebook. And she logged on, and that were, I can't remember exactly, in the book I mentioned, but there were like 59 friendship notifications, 37 message requests, and all from men wanting to take sexual advancements of these women from the favelas and promising them like better lives, saying, in exchange of sex, I'll give you a better life away from the favela. And then I remember one day she was really, she was busy, she needed to hurry. And then she was telling me what happened. She said, one day I got a friendship request. I saw that we had about 4 friends in common. And I thought the guy was someone I knew, because they had friends in common. And she said, someone that I wasn't remembering. So I accepted it. One day later, I look at what he sent me, showing their chat window on Facebook. It's his dick. It's his fucking dick. Why on earth would I want to say his fucking dick, you see? And we're talking about a lab, a computer space that is public. So she's opening this chat, not knowing what would show up for her. And she has to deal with such a depressive and digital harassment and abuse without, her consent and without her will. And they were always afraid of opening chats there because, let me move from this, because they just didn't know what they're gonna see. So that compromised their ability to communicate with people just because they were so afraid of opening the chat window. And another thing that I talk in the book is how these CTC spaces really shaped the experience that women had with technology. So these the telecenters and LAN houses were coded again according to gender, meaning that LAN houses were for boys and telecenters were for girls, and that was stipulated by the men in the favelas. This way, men do not, because men didn't let women into the LAN houses, they didn't let them play video games as they wanted. Which was interesting because women really wanted to play Call of Duty, for example, and FIFA, but men and the boys there didn't let them in there. And even the parents won't let the girls in there because it was such a masculine space. So they were not allowed to go in there. So their gaming experience, for example, was whatever they could access on the telecenters. And the computers in the telecenters was only running Ubuntu or a Linux-based operating system. So as you can imagine, they didn't have access to Call of Duty, to their favorite games. So they were frustrated and they were only stuck with playing Candy Crush and Farmville, where all of the girls that I talked to wanted to be in the LAN house playing Call of Duty. So this is a big call out to those studies that often perceive women not wanting to play violent games or sports games. Sometimes it's the institutional barriers that are set in the gaming spaces that don't let women to play the games that they want. So of course, if we look from outside and see the girls playing Candy Crush and the boys playing Call of Duty, someone might say, well, that's exactly what the literature says, right? Women love these pinky, bubbly games where men like these violent games. But if you look closely, it's not true. It's because the institutional barriers did not let women be part of the spaces where these games were available. So telecenters did not provide any sort of gaming experience, just whatever they could access on the computers. Yuan, how am I doing with the time?
I think it'll be great if you kind of have 7-8 minutes or less. That'd be great.
I will fly by here. Okay, so the next one, I talk about geographies of oppression. So throughout the book, I talk about what it means to be oppressed in the favelas. But then in this book, in this chapter, Geographies of Oppression, I talk about what it means to be a favela resident outside the favela. So I look into how the digital inequalities help or hinder their abilities to be part of the society. And for this, I talked about a phenomenon called the little strolls, which in Portuguese means rolezinho. I followed João for quite some time, and he wanted to be famous. And for him to be famous, he created all kinds of digital content so people could watch his YouTube videos, his memes on Facebook. People would really look up to him because he was creating all these cool media. He would dance in the telecenter weight room and having people recording him. So way before we had these dance moves on TikTok, João was there trying to be this famous figure in the community. And this was not just João. It was a movement in Brazil called Os Famosinhos, or the famous ones, that basically wanted to get some sort of acknowledgement based on their digital skills. So as João became famous, he started organizing the little strolls, the rolezinhos, which was also one thing that the famous teenagers did in other parts of the country. He started by organizing these hangouts in the local square of the favelas, and he absolutely enjoyed it. He appreciated how people would come and he would meet the fans, his friends would be his fans, so much so that he felt so confident that he thought that his next little stroll was going to be at the Victoria Mall, which is the largest mall in the city. in Brazil, shopping malls are spaces where rich and white people exercise their power, their purchasing power, and they're very protective of those spaces. And he wasn't aware that crossing social boundaries would actually cause any problems, because he said, well, I can produce any kind of digital content. I'm very digital literate. So they cannot do anything against me. So he felt very empowered, and he went to the mall. He started walking around with his friends, and in 15 minutes, and the story is kind of long, but I'll try to summarize here. In 15 minutes, there was another stroll happening, and because there were a miscommunication and the cops rushed into the crowd, and the crowd of Black kids start running away from the cops for reasons. The mall goers were often white and rich. They thought that it was having some sort of a massive robbery or something in the mall. So more cops were called into the mall, and all the Black people in the mall was separated from the white. They were forced to sit on the floor. João and his friends and other little stroll goers, they were forced to take off the shirt while the white people were surrounding them, filming them, booing them, and all they did was nothing. I mean, actually nothing. They were separated just because of the tone of their skin, because they were Black and poor. So I remember João crying after this, obviously saying, what is the point? What is the point of being digital inclusion? What is the point of knowing all these digital skills when I cannot even go to the mall in my city that I'm going to be treated this way? It was a very intense moment. I was really caught in the middle, and I was separated by them at that time, and I couldn't do anything. So I really saw with my bare eyes that just for doing nothing, they were judged just because they were Black and poor. They were kicked out of the mall. The next day, the mall released a statement saying that nothing was robbed, nothing was broken, nothing was vandalized, which endorses the question, why were they treated this way? It's a rhetorical question, because we all know, as I mentioned in the book. So this shows how basically Black poor people are treated in Brazil. It's not surprising that when I show those maps where you can see the Black and poor being segregated, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. So I'm going to rush through here, and I want to talk about the technology of the oppressor, because it's the latest research that I bring here. And this is another change of directions in the book, because so far I'm talking about the technology of the oppressed, but here in this chapter, I'm talking about the technology of the oppressor, basically how those who sit in positions of power appropriate technologies to exercise their will, and in Brazil was to promote the rise of the far right. They use WhatsApp and for doing that, I'm just going to rush here. They built what I call the social or the human infrastructure of misinformation, where in those groups, they had people who consumed misinformation. You had those who created misinformation, and also, and those who spread and shared misinformation. So it worked like a pyramid, where at the top you had who created, at the middle you had who spread misinformation, and at the very bottom you had those who consumed. So it was a perfect ecosystem where people were constantly consuming misinformation. Bolsonaro worked to delegitimize the mainstream press, so people turned to WhatsApp to consume all the information they needed and they wanted. Some of you might know, but Brazil is the #1 country in terms of WhatsApp use. WhatsApp is not just an app, it's a utility where people sell goods, communicate with family, they do business meetings, school meetings. It's way beyond just a texting app. It's truly an utility. However, it was also a space where they did a lot of misinformation. And basically the campaign that led Bolsonaro to rise and win. And then I finished this chapter by talking about how misinformation leads to radicalization, to the point that allowed people to buy guns and enter a school and kill 10 people in the state of Sao Paulo. And it started all in these radicalized WhatsApp groups. Also talk about the social supremacists that shared Nazi content. And they are a little bit like the incels, right? They also share pedophilia content. It's important to note that Nazi content and racist content and homophobic content are not allowed in Brazil. They're criminalized. So as you can imagine, these groups are outlawed. And then, of course, I finished the book with Technology of Hope because I couldn't end the book in such a depressing tone, because I was talking about the rise of the far right. And I went back. I finished the book with Technology of the Oppressor. I thought it was going to end there, but then I was that, well, it's not fair to my informants. It's also not fair to the reader. So I went back to Paulo Freire and read Pedagogy of Hope. And that really sparked an interest of writing another chapter about technology of hope, which is actually the mundane technology of those in the favelas. So I say that, and I conclude the book by saying that if we are to think about developing equitable technologies for a more just society, we should not expect the oppressed to always engage with their struggle. We should not demand them to appropriate digital artifacts, spaces, and processes in order to find liberation. They already face all sorts of oppressions, which are amplified through technologies. Digital technologies can only set them back. Digital technologies can not only set them back, but also make their path towards freedom extremely difficult. Following Freire's warning, if technology designers insist on imposing their own decisions on how technology should be prescribed and used, their technologies will never be about liberation or empowerment. They will cause even more oppression. Thus, to promote liberating and equitable technology, we should bring the concept of mundane technology to the roots of technological developments. The oppressed should be part of the decision-making process that will design the technologies of the future. Only then we might promote hope instead of oppression. So I'll finish right here. And I'm sorry that I was a little bit all over the place, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to show a little bit about everything that I talk in the book. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, David, for such a wonderful talk on all the aspects of how technology can be used, can be counter-used. It was really awesome. So now we would open it up to the audience. Yes, I see Katie. Katie, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks. Great talk, David. It was a lot of fun to hear you talk about things that I've read on paper or on a screen. So it kind of brought it to life. A couple of questions I had for you just in thinking about where this fits in terms of scholarship. How much are you engaging with the world of like ICT for D kind of research, or ideas about like technology maintenance, et cetera? Because, you know, you're in media studies, you're doing this project, but I'm just curious, like, where are you engaging with it? How much? Where are those linkages?
Yes, thank you, Katie. Yes, very much so. So in the first chapter, when I try to explain how I got to this idea of mundane technology, I try to draw from not so much about the gap, but how much the literature in ICT4D specifically tend to look at technology as just a tool, right? Or telecenters just a center, as if these spaces didn't really matter. So I go way beyond just thinking about a good design to solve a problem, but actually to look at the existing design and the existing technology to see how they relate to people. Most of the literature in ICT4D, it's a little frustrating because they talk about innovation. right? And I actually try to advocate for driving away from this innovation mentality, but to think about the everyday technology, because this is actually the technology that will likely to make an impact in people's lives, right? Not so much about an innovation that will come to the favela and solve the problem. So we know this is never going to happen. It actually brings more problem. So I criticize the ICT4D literature very much, which I had to tone down a little bit just because colleagues, and we want to also be nice. But I try to engage by bringing the STS literature on avoiding technological deterministic approaches. Try to look into the social construction of these technologies. What I also do is look into different actors that play a role in defining how phenomena are developed. So a little bit of Latour right there, but not being apolitical as, for example, ANT sometimes require us to be. So I very much acknowledge power. I acknowledge different actors that come into play when using technology or experiencing these different technologies and spaces and processes like repair. So instead of giving one way of looking how a person relates to technology, I try to take a broader look into how different actors play into defining a certain experience.
Yeah, I would also like to ask a question, David, for your talk. So I'm super interested in this idea of the community and technology centers. And since you're going for the thick description of these places, I would like to hear a little bit more. So specifically, I'm interested in two things. Like, first, who are the actors that maintain this place? You seem to paint a brush that it seems to be collectively managed, but could you talk a little bit more about like the financials, like who sponsors these things? Is it a government? Is it like collectively? And if it's collectively, what happens if somebody doesn't contribute? So that's my first question. And the second question is kind of related, is what have you observed instances where the technology breaks down in these CTCs? For example, if the computer isn't working, or if somebody is having like tremendous difficulty as you described, who teaches them and who transfers the knowledge in these CTCs when things don't work intendedly?
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for your great question. So yes, your first question is very good because I should have said this before. So land houses are privately owned by local favela residents. So they are usually like a spare room that they make, a little computer lab over there and let people use. Telecenters, and they cost money. So people usually had to spend about $1 1 hour. Whereas telecenters were free to use. They were maintained by the city government. And usually people would have 1 hour slot for free to use. And they would constantly rotate. So that was like the cons and pros. So in the telecenters, you were free to browse the internet. You didn't have to pay. However, the fun stuff was actually in the land houses, like the games, right? The Windows, so they could install the operating system, so they could install their favorite softwares and stuff. So two different, which is interesting because those are two different approaches, but they were very complementary to the needs of the favela folks. Land houses were really close to people's homes. As I mentioned, they were in the mid part of the favelas, which was really close to people's houses. The telecenters were on the extremes of the fields, so sometimes of the hill. So sometimes it was hard for them to get there, and telecenters wouldn't open on the weekends, for example, which most of the people, adults especially, only had time to use the internet during the weekends. And the second question, so breakdown in the favelas was a constant, not an exception. So they had to deal with breakdown constantly and develop their own techniques to maintain their technologies running. Remember, for land house owners, not having a computer working means that they're losing income. and income for them is critical, right? Whereas for telecenters, breaking a computer is not so much of a problem because they don't depend on people using for their income. In any case, they developed, like in the case of the power supply units, they developed their own techniques to recycle power supply units so they could use and exchange the PSUs every time there was a power outage, for example. The internet, right, that they had to create, Gustavo, for example, set a whole infrastructure to bring the internet all the way up there. What is interesting is that the land house owners, they all get their knowledge from online tutorials, YouTube videos. They didn't have a formal training. And the question that I get the most is like, eventually the internet is going to get to those places. Eventually people get money to buy a computer. These spaces will become obsolete, which is not true because land houses, in a good understanding of boundary objects, kept changing the role and the activity that it performed in the field because, at first it was a place for people to access internet. By the time that I was leaving the field, land houses had become the maintenance space of the favelas, meaning that whenever there was somebody's computer, somebody's laptop would break, they would bring their computers to the land house because the owner got the knowledge by fixing his own computers. He could sell that service to fix other people's computers. So it was changing according to the needs of the community. So it was far from being obsolete. Quite the contrary, it was very dynamic and very attentive to the needs of the communities. The same thing with telecenters. Due to the pandemic, the need to have a safe space for people to do, schoolwork was in need. And unfortunately, 2 years later, after I finished the field work, the City Hall canceled the telecenter program. So all the centers were closed because the mayor thought that, now the world's going wireless. So why would we have old, desktops where people can use, are mostly using the internet on their mobile phones, which is a fallacy because no one can engage with proper learning with their phones. No one can write school assignments on phones. Imagine you being an adult wanting to send a CV to get a new job, and all you have is a screen that you can barely type. Like, how do you type your CV on a phone? And it's also another fallacy because it's this belief that everyone has a smartphone, which is not true, right? So these centers are even so more valuable and in need now that I think it was when I first started this project. So, and again, not to think about, we're just talking about the technology. We're not even thinking about the social aspects of these spaces, right? They were vital community spaces for safety, for celebrating, birthdays, for anything. So, of course, when it comes to providing an atmosphere to make the lives easier for poor people, apparently it doesn't seem to be in the agenda of the government, which is a pity.
Thank you. That was lovely. Megan, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, David. My name is Megan. I'm a PhD student in the department here, and I was curious. I've seen a couple of studies and also just know kind of colloquially that their internet cafes have a similar kind of social function in parts of sub-Saharan Africa where I've done a bit of work. And I was curious, either from literature or I guess just trying to abstract a bit from the work that you've done, if you have a sense about whether some of the findings in the book are unique to like the parts of Brazil that you are doing research in, or if some of these threads we might see in other parts of the world in terms of like technologies of the oppressed.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. I think, of course, this is an ethnography, right? A book based on ethnographic research. And of course, ethnography is not about generalizations, but rather nuances of a specific field. But I think there are parallels that we can draw from the findings that may bring some light into studying other CDCs. And I say this because, one, it's this understanding that computer labs are not just a boring space where we just have computers, right? It's mainly a place meant for people. And when we have people in these spaces, they're socialized. We're inherently, social beings. So by looking into the sociality, we can find so much in there, even if it's just a boring, click on a like, to like an image. It's that like is immersed in such a dense cultural context that just by being there and understanding, you can, draw so many findings from it. So I think, they might find these spaces, safe spaces for chatting with boyfriends or girlfriends. There's this book by Jenna Burrell. I don't know if you've come across her book. She actually focused on cyber cafes in Ghana. Very good book. I cite her book in my book. It was interesting because it was a point of contact with the Western world. So basically how they talk to foreigners. And the layout of these cafes was set in a ways that would remind them of America or Europe. So, social spaces, and these social spaces are constantly being constructed and negotiated and changed just because we're constantly changing the ways that we relate to people. So yeah, I think, of course I'm a little biased here, but I think it could help you understand the construction of these spaces. Of course, the cartel shootouts, these are very specific to the favelas, but the need and the approach, the human approach to these spaces could also help you understand the human approaches to spaces in Africa.
Thank you. Are there other questions before we transition to the meeting with grad student exciting event?
I think Brian has a question here.
Yes, let's see. Okay, I'm just going to read it out. Thank you for visiting UW and for sharing your work, David. I'm so excited by your approaches to technology development, how you apply frameworks with STS, and the richness and depth of your ethnographic inquiries. All right, so yeah, Brian's very impressed and he really likes it, likes the talk.
Okay.
Okay, so for everyone who's not a grad student, thank you so much for participating in the event. David, we really enjoyed your talk. We loved.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, that was awesome, and we loved the Q&A as well. So thank you for joining. This was awesome.
No, thank you. This was great. Thank you for your time. Again, I'm sorry that you guys were my first ones to try this presentation. I have so much to change, but this was a great conversation. Thank you for this opportunity. I truly appreciate it.